Wall Street, the financial capital of the world, thrived in a constant state of frenetic energy. Its streets were filled with businesspeople dressed in sharp suits, their footsteps echoing against the cold, polished stone, while their eyes were fixed on the bright screens flashing stock prices, charts, and fluctuating numbers. The sound of the trading floor buzzed through the air, a symphony of frantic calls, clattering keyboards, and the occasional shout of triumph or defeat. In the midst of this controlled chaos, the promise of immense wealth loomed over everyone, like a carrot dangling just out of reach, forever just one deal away. For Daniel, a young and ambitious investor from a small town, Wall Street had always been a dream. It was where the best minds met, where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye, and where the bright lights of success shone brighter than anywhere else. He arrived with nothing but a sharp mind, a degree from a prestigious university, and a hunger to make his mark. He had studied the greats, Warren Buffett, George Soros, and the infamous figures of Wall Street's past, and dreamed of becoming one of them. The air smelled different here, sharp and electric, filled with endless possibilities. For Daniel, New York represented more than just a city. It was a test, a proving ground where he could carve out a future for himself, one trade at a time. But as he stepped onto the streets of Wall Street, something unsettled him. Amid the outward vibrancy and ambition, there was an underlying tension, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The towering buildings around him, their gleaming glass facades reflecting the busy streets, seemed to loom larger than life, casting long, dark shadows even during the day. The neon lights, so vibrant in the financial district, flickered at odd moments, and for a split second, Daniel thought he saw something move within the darkness between the buildings, an unnatural flicker in the corner of his eye. As Daniel walked past the faceless crowds, the murmurs of conversation seemed to fade into a distant hum. People moved like clockwork, their eyes fixed on their phones or their laptops, never acknowledging the ones around them. He realized that, in this city of towering ambition, the people were just as mechanical as the deals they made, driven by a single force: greed. The kind of greed that consumed everything in its path, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. He pushed the unsettling thoughts to the back of his mind. His eyes were set on the goal ahead, an opportunity to work with one of the most prestigious investment firms in the world, where the stakes were high and the rewards even higher. The firm had a reputation that was both thrilling and terrifying, an almost mythical place where the greatest minds came together to control vast amounts of wealth, shaping the very flow of the global economy. Daniel entered the building for his first day, the cool, sterile interior contrasting sharply with the heat of the bustling streets outside. The fluorescent lights hummed above him as he walked through the marble-tiled lobby, the sound of his footsteps a sharp contrast to the distant rumblings of the city. The receptionists were professional, but their smiles seemed forced, their eyes too quick to avert from his gaze. He wondered if anyone here ever truly smiled. The employees all looked the same, exhausted, yet driven, as though something more than just ambition pushed them forward. At his desk, the computer screen flickered to life, illuminating his face in its cold glow. The numbers on the stock market appeared like an endless ocean, vast and unyielding. He glanced at the messages flooding his inbox, each one more urgent than the last, but his eyes wandered toward the window. He could see the great expanse of the city stretching out before him, an urban jungle, its jagged skyline piercing the sky like a series of dark knives. But as his gaze shifted, he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. In one of the buildings across the street, the reflection in the glass seemed wrong, distorted. There was a figure standing behind a window, pale, ghostly, and faceless. For a moment, it looked directly at him. The figure's eyes were hollow, black voids that sent a shudder through him. But as quickly as it appeared, the reflection vanished. Daniel blinked, unsure if it had even happened. He shook his head, brushing it off as the result of the long flight and lack of sleep. After all, Wall Street was a place full of pressure, where the mind played tricks on you. But as he refocused on the screen, a strange sensation gnawed at him, one he couldn't quite shake, a feeling that something was not right, that this city, this place, had a dark, ancient secret hiding beneath its glittering surface. Daniel didn't know it yet, but his journey in Wall Street had just begun, and the deeper he went into the world of high finance, the closer he would come to uncovering something far more terrifying than he ever imagined. The shadow of something older and darker than greed lurked in the background, and Wall Street's promises of wealth and power were merely a facade. Something waited patiently beneath the surface, ready to claim its next victim. Daniel quickly settled into his role at the prestigious investment firm, a place where ambition and cutthroat competition defined the rhythm of the day. At first, everything appeared exactly as he had imagined. Fast-paced, high stakes, and full of opportunity. The days were long, filled with strategic meetings, frantic phone calls, and the endless flow of financial data that seemed to dictate the lives of everyone in the office. The firm's sleek, modern offices on the upper floors of a towering skyscraper were equipped with state-of-the-art technology, and the walls were lined with glass windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. However, there was something unnerving about the building, something Daniel couldn't quite place. During the day, everything was business as usual. His colleagues were impressive, experienced, sharp, and driven. They had the air of people who had seen it all and knew that no transaction, no matter how large, was too daunting. Daniel found himself eager to prove himself among them, believing that his hard work and intellect would be enough to secure his place in this world. But as the sun began to set each evening, something began to change. The office floor, once buzzing with energy, started to empty out. The faint sounds of chatter were replaced by the soft hum of air conditioning, the clicking of keyboards, and the occasional clink of a coffee cup. The lights, which were always brightly lit during the day, began to flicker as the last of the employees left for the night. It wasn't a constant flicker, but it was enough to be noticeable, as if the building itself was fighting against the electricity coursing through its veins. At times, the flickering lights would dim to a dull glow, casting long, unsettling shadows along the walls. It started with small noises. At first, Daniel thought they were the sounds of the building settling, a creaking, a groan in the floorboards, maybe the wind whistling through the cracks. But as time went on, the noises grew louder, more distinct. He would hear the sound of footsteps echoing in the halls late at night when he knew that no one else was around. Sometimes, it sounded like whispers, soft voices murmuring in a language he couldn't understand, so quiet that he could barely hear them over the sound of his own breath. Other times, it was the unmistakable sound of someone softly tapping on the glass windows from the outside. But when Daniel would rush to look, there was never anyone there. At first, he brushed these occurrences off, chalking them up to stress or fatigue. After all, the pressure of his new job was immense. Long hours, impossible deadlines, and a constant sense of being under scrutiny had him on edge. But the noises persisted, growing in frequency and intensity. On more than one occasion, Daniel would be sitting at his desk, poring over financial reports, when he'd hear the distinct sound of a door creaking open behind him. He'd turn around in a flash, heart pounding, only to find the office door still shut tight. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was watching him. Waiting point one night, after the office had cleared out, Daniel found himself working late. The firm had just closed a massive deal, and he was tasked with reviewing the final figures before they were submitted to the client. As he sat in the corner office, alone in the dim light, he noticed something odd. The reflection in the window, at first, he assumed it was his own, seemed to shimmer, distorted in a way that didn't seem quite right. His face appeared slightly out of focus, like a shadow of himself rather than the real thing. But when he looked more closely, the reflection didn't mirror him exactly. In the glass, he saw a figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and an unnatural, twisted smile. The figure was standing just behind him, just within his peripheral vision. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, and his body froze in place. He turned quickly, his heart racing in his chest, but there was nothing behind him. The office was empty, silent except for the low hum of the lights. He couldn't shake the image from his mind. Was it a trick of the light? His imagination playing games with him? Or was it something else, something darker, something that had been here long before he arrived? The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. As he walked through the building's sleek lobby, he noticed that the once bustling office floor was quieter than usual. There were fewer employees milling around, fewer conversations. Even the coffee machine seemed to be silent, as though everyone was in on some unspoken secret. He couldn't resist anymore. He approached one of his colleagues, a seasoned trader named Sarah, whom he had worked alongside during the past week. Sarah was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed and efficient, always dressed impeccably, with a demeanor that spoke of years of experience navigating the tumultuous world of finance. "Sarah," Daniel said cautiously, lowering his voice as if he were about to divulge something personal, Have you ever noticed anything strange happening here after hours? Strange noises? Lights flickering?" Sarah glanced at him quickly, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before she straightened and plastered a neutral smile on her face. "Strange? What do you mean?" she replied, her tone casual but slightly guarded. "It's just the building, probably. Old buildings can get a little temperamental sometimes." Daniel nodded, but something in Sarah's eyes told him she knew more than she was letting on. Still, she didn't press further, and the conversation quickly shifted back to business. The same pattern continued with every other colleague he spoke to. No one would discuss anything out of the ordinary. There were no offers to help explain his suspicions, no shared experiences. Everyone seemed to have perfected the art of ignoring the eerie atmosphere that clung to the firm, as if it were some unspoken truth that was better left undisturbed. But the more Daniel pushed for answers, the more distant and uneasy his colleagues became. One afternoon, after hearing a colleague, Mark, mutter something about the old company, Daniel felt a spark of curiosity. Mark had been with the firm for over a decade, his eyes always sharp with the kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving the volatile world of finance for so long. The old company? Daniel asked, approaching Mark in the break room. Mark's face paled slightly, and he hesitated for a moment, looking around as if to make sure no one else was listening. He leaned in, his voice a whisper. "You're new here, right? You don't know about the history of this place, do you?" Mark asked. Daniel shook his head, eager to learn more. Mark looked away, his eyes darting nervously. "We don't talk about it. Not here. It's better if you don't ask. Trust me, better not to ask." Daniel pressed, confusion turning into unease. "Just stay focused on your work. That's all you need to know," Mark muttered, and then walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, his thoughts racing. The haunting truth. Later that evening, unable to shake his growing sense of dread, Daniel did some research. He dug through the company's history, its financial reports, and even some old news articles. That's when he found the unsettling truth. The firm had once been part of an even older, more mysterious company that had mysteriously vanished after a series of catastrophic bankruptcies. Employees had disappeared without a trace, and rumors of illegal dealings, shadowy financial schemes, and occult practices had plagued the company's downfall. The deeper Daniel dug, the more disturbing the information became. He learned that many of the company's former leaders had been involved in strange, unexplainable events in the years leading up to the firm's collapse. Some spoke of deals made in the dead of night, in darkened boardrooms, where financial decisions were guided by forces far beyond profit and loss. Others mentioned a strange ritual that the old company's leaders would perform, something involving blood and wealth, though none of the details were ever confirmed. Daniel now understood why his colleagues were so silent. They weren't simply trying to ignore the building's oddities, they were trying to protect themselves. The firm, and perhaps Wall Street itself, had been built on more than just stock exchanges and profits. It had been built on something far darker, something that had never fully let go. And now, Daniel realized he was becoming a part of it, uncovering the dark secret. As Daniel dug deeper into the firm's past, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something fundamentally wrong beneath the surface. What had started as a series of unsettling noises and eerie reflections had now morphed into something far more sinister. He began researching the history of the firm, digging through old news reports, financial records, and obscure references in the deepest corners of the internet. What he uncovered left him shaken. There was a strange tale buried in the firm's history, a tale about a group of early investors who had mysteriously disappeared overnight. These investors had been involved in a secret project that promised super profits, a scheme designed to manipulate the financial markets through highly unorthodox and risky means. As the story went, the investors had turned to dangerous, unconventional methods to achieve their wealth, methods that went beyond mere market manipulation and ventured into the occult. The project, referred to cryptically as the Serpent Deal, was said to have been a financial venture that involved secretive trades with unnamed entities, trades that were far from ordinary. It was rumored that these investors had struck deals with dark forces, manipulating stock prices, influencing economic policies, and even coercing rival firms into financial ruin. What was more chilling was the suggestion that the investors' success had not come solely from their financial acumen, but from a far more sinister source of power, dark rituals that they had performed in the dead of night. They called it the summoning, a ceremony involving strange symbols, whispered incantations, and blood sacrifices. The project was a massive success, at least in terms of financial gain. But just as suddenly as it began, it ended. One morning, the investors were gone, vanished. Their bank accounts were emptied, their assets dissolved, and they disappeared without a trace. No one in the company spoke of them again, and the firm moved on as if nothing had happened. But the whispers never stopped. Those who had been around at the time hinted that the firm's sudden rise to power had come at a great cost, one that could never be paid off. As Daniel read the last of the articles, a chilling realization washed over him. The same firm he was working for, the one that had seemed so successful, had roots in something much darker than he had ever imagined. He began to feel the weight of what he was a part of, the creeping fear that the success of the firm wasn't just due to sharp minds and business savvy. It was because of something much more dangerous, and that something was now beginning to take hold of him too. The meeting at the bar. His mind raced, and his thoughts turned to the strange man he had overheard at the office. Daniel had heard whispers about a former employee who had been with the company for years but had left abruptly under strange circumstances. No one seemed to know much about him, but the few who mentioned his name seemed to do so with an air of fear and discomfort. His name was Robert, and he had worked as a senior advisor for the firm's international trading division before suddenly vanishing. A week later, Daniel found himself in a dark bar in the heart of Manhattan, his nerves frayed and his mind filled with questions he couldn't answer. The bar was quiet, a typical haunt for those who worked long hours in the city, looking to unwind after a day in the office. Daniel was nursing a drink when a shadow fell across the bar, and he looked up to find a tall, wiry man standing in front of him. His face was gaunt, with hollow eyes and an unsettling smile. "Daniel, I presume?" the man said, his voice smooth but carrying a hint of something darker. It took Daniel a moment to recognize him, but when he did, his heart skipped a beat. The man before him was Robert. He had seen him in old photos during his initial research into the company's history. But the man who stood before him now looked different, older, more worn. There was something in his eyes, something that made Daniel feel uneasy. "I know what you've been reading," Robert continued, as he slid into the seat next to Daniel. "You've been poking around in places you shouldn't. The truth, Daniel, is much darker than you can imagine." Robert's words sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Robert's lips twisted into a tight smile. "I was there when they started the Serpent deal. I was part of it, and I watched everything fall apart. The wealth, the power, it wasn't real. It was a facade, a trap set by something much older, much more powerful than any of us realized." Daniel leaned forward, his heart racing. "What are you talking about? What happened to those people? Why did they vanish?" Robert's expression darkened, and he looked around the bar as if making sure no one was listening. "It's not just money we're dealing with here. It never was. We made a deal with something beyond human understanding, something that controls more than just the markets. We thought we could control it, but we were wrong. The moment we tried to break free, it started taking us one by one." He paused, as if deciding whether to reveal more. "The firm, this place you're working for, Daniel, it's cursed. Those who got involved in the Serpent deal didn't just trade financial futures, they traded their very souls. The company's success has come at a terrible price. And you, my friend, are now a part of it." Daniel's mind reeled. The words hung heavy in the air, each one sinking into him like a weight. "What are you saying? What's happening to me?" Robert leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've already made the deal, Daniel. You just don't know it yet. Everything you've done, every trade you've made, it's all part of the game. You think you're just another cog in the machine, but you're not. You've already crossed the line. You've chosen to stay, and now you're trapped in the same web the others were. The more you climb, the more you'll be consumed by it." Daniel's mind was spinning. He had no idea how deep the darkness went. The success of the firm, the strange noises, the odd occurrences, it was all beginning to make sense, and yet it made no sense at all. He wanted to get up, to leave, but something held him there, something intangible, something pulling him in. "What do I do?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Robert's eyes darkened. "There's nothing you can do now. You're in the game, and the game doesn't let you out. Not unless it's finished with you." Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine as Robert stood up, his smile never faltering. "Just remember, Daniel, there's always a price, and it's always more than you bargained for." Despite the growing fear gnawing at him, Daniel couldn't stop. He had already crossed the line, and his curiosity had transformed into a need to uncover the truth, to understand what lay beneath the surface of the firm, and perhaps to find a way out. The nightmares had started, yes, but so had the strange, unexplainable occurrences. At first, it was just the flickering lights, the whispering shadows in the corners of his vision, but as he delved deeper, it felt like the firm itself was closing in on him, as if the walls of the building had eyes. Every night, as he sat at his desk, he would hear faint whispers, voices coming from the speakers of his computer, murmuring unintelligible words that seemed to reach him from another dimension. His dreams became distorted, filled with visions of endless rows of stock tickers scrolling past him, their numbers changing at an alarming pace. In these dreams, he would be trapped in a dark room, surrounded by the firm's cold, unfeeling figures, all working on transactions that seemed to go on forever. His mind would spiral deeper into confusion as his hands involuntarily typed out figures, making trades he didn't authorize, deals that felt both foreign and terrifying. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the feeling of dread lingering long after the nightmare ended. He tried to talk to his colleagues, but the more he brought up the strange occurrences, the more distant they became. Conversations became clipped and uncomfortable. They began to avoid him, never speaking to him directly, as if he had become a threat, something corrupted by the very darkness he sought to expose. Even his closest friend at the firm, Sarah, seemed to pull away from him. She stopped meeting his eyes, and when he tried to speak with her, she would nod quickly and walk away, her gaze haunted. One evening, Daniel stayed late, unable to tear himself away from the growing compulsion to find answers. The office was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the computers and the distant sound of traffic below. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him urged him to check the firm's electronic transaction board. His heart pounded as he approached the screen, and as the numbers loaded, he froze. There, at the top of the list, was an unfamiliar transaction, a massive transfer worth millions of dollars from an account he didn't recognize to an offshore holding company. His account. The transaction had been made under his name, but he had no memory of authorizing it. It was as if someone or something had taken control of his account, using his identity to make this bizarre, illegal transaction. He felt an icy grip on his chest as the realization sank in. The deal had been done, and it had been done through him. The room seemed to close in on him. The walls, once comforting and familiar, felt oppressive, suffocating. His mind raced as he clicked through the transaction logs, hoping for an explanation, but there was nothing. No sign of who had initiated the transaction or why it had been completed. It was as if the digital trail had been wiped clean, leaving nothing but an empty void. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead as he backed away from the screen. His breath was shallow, his pulse erratic. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts, but the room seemed to spin around him. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, but when he glanced at the screen, his finger froze just above the call button. He thought he saw something moving in the reflection on the glass, the figure from his nightmares, standing just behind him. The twisted, faceless figure he had seen in the window, staring back at him. The moment he turned around, the figure was gone, and the office was empty as it had been for hours. But the lingering sense of dread remained. Unable to make sense of what was happening, Daniel began to doubt his own sanity. Was he losing his mind? Or had he truly become part of something far darker than he could comprehend? He thought back to Robert's warning, the price of ambition, the price of entering the game. Could this be the cost? That night, he tried to sleep, hoping for some relief from the overwhelming paranoia and fear. But sleep, when it came, was not restful. It was filled with the same nightmare that had been haunting him for days, endless rows of numbers, each one shifting and changing at an impossible speed. But this time, something was different. As the numbers spiraled out of control, the figures in the room with him began to turn their heads toward him, their faces becoming clearer with each passing second. They were not his colleagues. They were the faces of those who had come before him, those who had disappeared after the serpent deal. Their eyes were hollow, their skin gray and lifeless, their mouths twisted in agony as they reached out to him, their hands pulling him into the darkness. He woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, his body rigid with fear. His room, once familiar and safe, now felt like a prison. The same faces, the same cold grip of terror, still lingered in his mind. He had to get out. He had to escape this nightmare. But as he tried to get up, he noticed something that sent a fresh wave of panic through him. On his desk, his computer had powered on by itself, and the same transaction that had haunted him before was now flashing on the screen, as though mocking him. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And Daniel knew, with a sickening certainty, that there was no turning back. As the days passed, the strange occurrences grew worse. His nightmares became more vivid, more real. His waking hours were filled with visions of the same twisted figures, following him, watching him. The firm, once a place of opportunity, had become his prison, and the deal he had unknowingly entered into was tightening its grip. His mind began to unravel, and the more he tried to dig for answers, the more he realized that he was becoming part of the game, a game he could no longer escape. The dark forces that had infiltrated the firm had claimed him, and now there was no way out. Daniel's disappearance was as abrupt as it was unnerving. One day, his office was open, just as it had always been, his desk neat, his computer screen still displaying the same unsettling transaction logs he had left behind. But Daniel was gone, vanishing without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no notes left behind, just an empty chair, a half-empty coffee cup, and a lingering sense of something deeply wrong. The firm continued as if nothing had happened, its cold, clinical routines unaffected by his absence. His colleagues, those few who still remained in the office, avoided the subject of Daniel entirely. When his name was mentioned, they quickly changed the topic or hurried away, eyes wide with unease. The firm, it seemed, had no room for questions, no room for concern. The invisible forces that Daniel had uncovered continued their work, manipulating the financial world with impunity, leaving no trace of their existence except for the eerie undercurrents that seemed to flow beneath every trade and every deal. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear to everyone who worked at the firm that Daniel had been swallowed up by the very forces he had tried to expose. The office was still buzzing with activity, but there was a noticeable absence of life in the air. The whispers, the dark presence, still lingered. Invisible transactions continued to flood the firm's network, and phones rang endlessly, their calls never answered. Some days, when the sun dipped low behind the skyscrapers, employees swore they saw ghostly figures lurking in the glass windows, their faces distorted in silent screams. But no one dared to speak of it. No one dared to acknowledge that the darkness, the malevolent forces that had claimed Daniel, were still there, always watching, always waiting for the next soul to succumb to their grip. The firm carried on, an endless cycle of wealth and power built on the suffering of those who played the game. And in this world, ambition was both the prize and the curse. For every soul that rose to the top, there was always another waiting to be devoured by the darkness that lay hidden behind the gleaming walls of Wall Street. And so, as I stand here now, telling you this story, I must warn you, the financial world, in all its grandeur and promise, is not what it seems. The numbers, the deals, the fortunes, these are not the true stakes. Behind the scenes, there are forces that we cannot comprehend, pulling strings, guiding decisions, and bending the rules of fate itself. If you dare to step into this world, be aware that every trade you make, every decision you commit to, is watched. You are never truly alone. And if you aren't careful, one day you might find yourself just like Daniel, lost, forgotten, and part of a game that you'll never be able to leave. Daniel's grip on reality had long since begun to slip. The more he tried to fight the creeping influence that had taken hold of him, the more it consumed him. The walls of the firm, once sleek and professional, now seemed to close in around him, pulsing with an energy that was both oppressive and suffocating. He could feel the air grow thicker, as though something ancient and malevolent was watching him from every shadow. It was no longer a matter of financial transactions. He was no longer concerned with the numbers that used to dominate his mind. The game had changed, and Daniel was no longer playing it. He was the plaything. The whispers that once seemed like figments of his imagination were now real. At night, the sounds came from everywhere, soft murmurs, low and seductive, slipping through the cracks in the office walls. They weren't just the faint echoes of the building settling anymore. No, they were voices calling him, urging him to make the next trade, the next deal. Each time he tried to resist, the pressure became unbearable, forcing him to comply. His hands would move involuntarily across the keyboard, typing in strange codes and making transactions he didn't understand, all while the figures on the other side of the trade seemed to grow darker and more distorted. As the days wore on, Daniel began to lose himself. The mirror reflection that once showed his tired but determined face now showed something else, something hollow, like a lifeless mask, worn by a body that no longer belonged to him. He could no longer distinguish his own thoughts from those of the unseen forces that had infiltrated his mind. His identity, once clear, had become blurred, like an echo in a canyon, faint, fading, and impossible to hold on to. The firm's office, which had once been a place of ambition and success, had become a breeding ground for his torment. The other investors, once his colleagues, were vanishing one by one. At first, Daniel thought it was just coincidence, the high-pressure nature of the job, the overwhelming stress, but as more and more of them disappeared, he realized that it was something far more sinister. They were disappearing without a trace, as though they had never existed. Their desks were left untouched, their phones left ringing unanswered, but no one seemed to talk about it. The entire firm remained in a state of uncomfortable silence, as if acknowledging the disappearances would somehow make them real. And then, one night, it happened. He was alone in the office, once again staring at the trading screen, his fingers moving almost mechanically as he executed yet another deal. But this time, something felt different. The air grew colder, and a shadow passed over the screen, casting an unnatural pallor over the numbers that flickered in front of him. He froze. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure standing just beyond his reach, its features obscured by the darkness, but its eyes glowing faintly. He could feel its gaze, piercing through him like a blade. It was then that the ghosts began to appear. They weren't the ghosts of the old investors in the traditional sense. There was no ethereal glow or floating presence. These were real, solid, and deeply unsettling. They were the same men and women Daniel had read about in the company's dark past, those who had vanished after the serpent deal. But now, they were back. Their faces were gaunt and hollow, their eyes sunken into their skulls, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They walked through the office as though they owned it, their movements jerky and unnatural, their forms flickering in and out of existence like television static. The ghosts weren't just lingering around the office, they were following him, always close, always watching. Every time Daniel tried to leave, they were there, appearing in his peripheral vision, watching from the corners of the room, their hollow eyes never leaving him. And it wasn't just their presence that terrified him, it was their whispers. Soft at first, then louder and more insistent, they spoke in a language Daniel couldn't understand, their words scraping against his mind like nails on a chalkboard. Then, the true horror began. Daniel found himself in one of his nightmares, only this time it wasn't a dream. He was standing in the center of the firm's trading floor, surrounded by rows of empty desks, the soft hum of the machines the only sound. But as the ghosts of the old investors materialized before him, they weren't just staring, they were speaking. Their mouths moved, but their voices didn't come from their lips. They came from the air itself, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to vibrate in his chest. "Trade," they whispered. "Make the deal. You've come so far, Daniel. You're just one step away." Daniel's heart raced, the pressure building until he could hardly breathe. He tried to turn away, but his body wouldn't obey. His fingers moved of their own accord, typing in numbers, executing trades that made no sense. But the deal wasn't about money. The prices were no longer just numbers, they were souls, each transaction stripping away another piece of his humanity. The air around him grew thick with the weight of the deals being struck, and the figures in the room closed in, surrounding him. He could feel them pulling at him, tugging him into their world, dragging him into a place where the lines between reality and nightmare were no longer clear. The transactions were no longer about wealth, they were about domination, control, and the exchange of souls. And Daniel realized, too late, that he had been playing a part in this dark ritual from the very beginning. "You've made your choice, Daniel," one of the ghosts said, its voice like a cold wind. "There's no going back now." In that moment, Daniel understood. He wasn't just an investor in this game. He was the prey. The dark forces that had been lurking in the shadows of Wall Street had risen, fully awakened, and he had become a pawn in their twisted game, a game where every trade was a step closer to his own damnation. As the ghosts closed in around him, their cold hands reaching for his soul, Daniel's vision blurred. The screens before him flickered one last time, showing a final, horrifying message. "You are no longer Daniel. You are part of the game, and you will never leave."